And that's really actually pretty similar to what I experienced on my first deployment to Iraq, where never mind anything. We were happy to be out doing operations.
Yeah.
Like, we were going to go do real operations. Man, we were, the strategy, the danger, the whatever. It was like, hey, we are here. We are doing operations to catch bad guys. Awesome. That was our focus.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you were in the mindset, that similar mindset. And it
Totally.
did, it took me a couple months of being in Iraq and getting that out of my system before I was like, okay, so let's take a look at what we're actually doing here and how we're trying to affect the battle space, because I was just too young and inexperienced, and I just need to get some experience under my belt. So sounds like, and really sounds like Ireland kind of prepares you for that, but I also look at, okay, so let's just go straight then to, you get the call. How did you know you were going to get the call to go to Iraq? Was it a lottery? How did they just say, hey, we want to get you down there? How did that work?
The way it worked at Reuters was no photographer was ever forced to go to a hostile environment. So it wasn't part of your remit that if you work for Reuters, you must go to a hostile environment. They were never like that. And you can see why. What they
is
want.
it wrong for me to picture every photographer? Because I put my personality over a guy with a camera, and so I think like every guy with a camera is going, I want to go to the war zone tomorrow. Is that not true?
No, that's not true. There are a lot of guys that don't want to go anywhere near a hostile environment.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, that's important for me to know these things, because I would, in my mind, everyone's just thinking, I'm going to go get after it. Oh, I got a camera. There's a war going on.
Yeah.
Let's go make it happen.
Yeah. I mean, that was then. That was 2003. I would say maybe it's slightly changed now. There are a lot more photographers, young photographers, going to war zones. But then, no, it was, I think if I remember rightly, they because the build up to the war was so,
prolonged.
Yeah. I mean, we knew it was going to happen. And immediately there were those guys that wanted to, there was one that embedded with the artillery in Kuwait. So he had a month wait in Kuwait and then just went with the artillery. There were Reuters had very seasoned photographers, very experienced in those sort of environments that would then embed with Americans or Brits, and those were the guys that were being shot at on a daily basis, but extremely hard to produce imagery from those situations. And I remember I had a very good friend of mine said to me, who did a lot of that stuff, he said, Kieran, the thing about going and embedding with a soldier is that you can get in the way, and the last thing you want is to compromise a unit. But they set these units up and they said, yep, the media has to come in and, show us what's happening. But most of the time, he said, you have your head down and your hand in the air and you're just blindly shooting and hoping. And he said, invariably, you get nothing. I mean, that's not always the case, but he said majority of the time. And you have to do it a lot before your sort of hit rate, gets moved up. And if you're embedded, I think you struggle. If you go unilaterally, which is the really unsafe way to do it, so
right.
you're on your own.
You're on your own.
You're
just going to show up there and take pictures.
There, you've got the chance of getting something, and again, it's being in the right place at the right time. So they'd said they had certain guys in place that stuck their hands up straight away. Yep, I'm doing that. That's me. I'll be embedded there, and I'll do this and I'll do that. And we spent a month looking at the stuff that was coming out, and it was invariably pictures of soldiers in sandstorms and stuff like that. There was no action. It was. Well, I wouldn't say that was true from all of them, but the majority of the case, it was very difficult to produce imagery when you're embedded. I certainly wasn't interested in being a unilateral at that time at all, but I was really interested in going and doing what happens after the war. So what interests me is the people afterwards. I always tend to think that people go in and shoot what's happening and that moves on, and then the photographers move on with them. And I wanted to just sort of go in that backdraft and photograph what was happening life-wise after, soldiers had been in there. And that's exactly what I said. I said I'd be happy to go to Baghdad, pretty much almost once it's secure. it didn't quite work out that way. I think we went a little bit earlier.
Never does it?
Yeah, and it never is as secure as you think. And I remember, I think I got the day after the statue of Saddam was pulled down,
Right.
And it was a moment of euphoria for Baghdad, and I just thought, hey, you know what? This isn't. I mean, my first trip to Belfast was worse than this.
Mm-hmm.
This is okay, but we turned up and had faced with the problem of one of our cameramen had just been killed under friendly fire, and that had taken a huge hit on Reuters, and that really hit home that actually this is really not a safe place, because there's still an awful lot going on, and there's still an awful lot of misunderstanding, and so that was a real leveler when we got out there, and staying in the Palestine Hotel was incredibly exciting because there were just photographers and journalists and just buzzing around everywhere, and you would think, okay, I'm here now, so what am I going to do? And it was almost as if I had to get out there and start shooting. And I didn't care what it was that I started shooting. I'm here. Now I need to start shooting something.
So that is the feeling that I had in my first deployment to Iraq. Like, let's go do missions.
Yeah. So, and I said to the chief photographer out there, I said, Jack, what do you want me to do? He said, I don't know. Walk out into the square and see what's happening. So I did, and I walked out into the square, and there were kids playing around in the main square, in the fountain.
Because you kind of we were talking about this earlier today, but you just said the word euphoric, right?
Mm.
And a lot of people, because the war in Iraq actually is still going on right now, but it's really easy to forget the initial, 4 or 5 weeks after it started, when we had crushed, Saddam's regime, and now the people were waving American flags. The Iraqi people were waving American flags. They were hugging. They were happy. And it's really easy to forget that because things turned so bad.
Really,
within a couple months they had turned bad, and then they went down from there.
Yeah.
But you were just like, oh, you know what? I'm going to go out outside the Palestine Hotel, which is by the way across the river from the Green Zone, but it still was a very well protected. Fairly well protected hotel that a lot of Westerners stayed in. Yeah. And you just said, oh, I'm going to walk outside and check it out. No security. Just getting
nothing.
After it.
Yeah, just what can I shoot? And I found this picture of this kid, and I still have that picture on my website. But it's a little kid, and he just pulls his head out of the water, and he's swimming in this fountain, and you wouldn't believe what was in the fountain. I couldn't believe these kids were swimming in it, but he just sort of popped his head out and stood there and flexed his muscles. And it was just a young 9-10-year-old guy just flexing his muscles, and the light was fantastic, and it just made such a beautiful image. I mean, it really did. And I thought, okay, I've just got here, and I've shot a really nice picture, and I felt really proud of myself, and I thought, okay, and I just walked that back in, and of course there was mayhem happening. And what Reuters were actually doing was they were in the process of moving out of the Palestine Hotel to a house that they'd rented, because we were then becoming quite a big outfit, and the Palestine Hotel was never going to house it, the amount of staff that we had. So we were moving out to a big house just a couple of blocks away. But again, it was like Belfast. I had got something under my belt, and I felt pretty good about it, and I thought, okay, right, let's bring it on. Let's see how many places I can get to, how many stories I can shoot every day. And I didn't want to stop shooting. I wanted to get up at 7 a.m. and go and work with the light, and then middle of the day was never really a good time to shoot because the light was dreadful, and then I'd wait for the sort of late afternoon and the golden hour, which became tricky because we were never really allowed to be out at dark. So I just wanted to shoot. And of course it didn't quite work out that way, because there are certain responsibilities on a photographer whose first language is English when you go into a place like Baghdad, where the captioning on images is extremely important. And it's extremely important that the captioning is correct, the information is correct, it's valid, verified, and it has no spelling mistakes. And of course, being the only photographer in there that first language was English, I ended up...
Where are most of the photographers from?
Well, we had, all over Europe.
Okay.
We had different, and there was maybe only four of us in there at a time, 3 or 4 of us in there at a time.
So you got a French, a guy, a German guy.
Yeah, Croatian. Yeah, absolutely. And we were all looking for, we're all looking for those great pictures. So, you began to wonder, okay, how's this going to be divided up every day? Who's going to get what? Am I going to get...
Are you looking for pictures at this point that are good pictures that you want to see, or are you looking for pictures that are going to be news, are going to be front page newspaper? Which one of those two, or is it both?
Primarily, if I'm completely honest.
Because a picture of, like, when you describe that picture of a kid pulling his head out of this dirty water, he's 10 years old and he's flexing, that's just an awesome image, right? And I'm sure that's a great picture. That picture's not going on the front page of newspapers, though, is it?
Absolutely not.
But you don't. But that's your focus. Is I want to get good pictures that are capturing the images of what you're seeing around you, as opposed to, hey, I just want this front page picture.
Yeah, I was never really one for looking for publications. I was always shooting for me. Somebody once asked me in an interview, "Who's your biggest audience?" I said, "Well, me," because that's who I'm shooting for. So I'm not looking to please editors or whatever. Obviously, it helps if they're pleased with what you've done, yeah. But I was primarily looking to satisfy myself, and that's never changed with me. And so, yeah, I totally understand that, when you're in a situation, I say that, but obviously we'll get on to something later that showed I completely didn't understand. But I understand when there's the front page, and I understand the impacts, and I understand what they mean to the company. Totally. And don't get me wrong, when I was getting front pages, it was a great feeling. It sort of justified the fact that you were out there and you were doing it. But there are so many other agencies out there and so many other photographers out there. You have to get really lucky. You just have to get that one image that separates it from everyone else. And I knew how difficult that is. So I never concerned myself with looking for that image. I sort of began to think, listen, if I think the image is strong, you have a bit of confidence in your own ability to judge whether or not an image is strong or not, and whether or not it has a good chance of making. So if you're not, if it's say, listen, it's features today, just go out and find something that, every picture you shoot's not going to tell the story of what's happening in Iraq. But for me, that picture of that boy that day, 3 days after whatever Baghdad had been liberated, that showed a kid playing in the water and feeling happy. And I thought, yeah, do you know what? That's what's happening. That whatever's happening in Baghdad now that child is a conduit for it at the moment. Yeah,
it captures totally. The emotion and the spirit of what's going on around you.
Yeah,
and that's a good overall, I think, attitude to have with everyone. And you hear this all the time, right? People say, go with your heart is basically what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And I'm in agreement with you. And again, we've talked about this before, even just with what we're doing here, this is based on what we want to do in our toughest audience, or our most important audience is like, us, what do we want to do? How do we feel about making this? And how does it feel to record it? And how does it feel when I put the headphones on and listen to it? Is it what I want to hear? Because I'm doing it, and we're doing it more for the value of itself rather than, there's no doubt that we're not saying, hey, everybody listen to this, because we know that this isn't for everybody.
Yeah.
And we're okay with that. And I think that's a good attitude to have.
Yeah.
That's usually how it turns out the best anyway, because you know what you like, and you know what's going to make what you like good or look good in your case. If you try to estimate what everyone else likes, all you have is this like
gray, brownish water mush.
That,
totally.
Yeah, and you're not talking about just one other individual that you know really good. You're talking about a bunch of people. So a lot of times people, and it turns out real obvious when they're trying to please other people with what they're doing. And it goes for so many things, just like how you're saying.
Yeah.
So, they're trying to basically play for the cheap seats. They're trying, they're trying to, we talk about this where the goal should be doing a good job, doing the best that you can do. And we talk about it with jiu-jitsu, with everything. The belt isn't the goal. The front page, that's not the goal. The goal is to do the best that you can do for your work, you know?
Yeah.
And like I said, if you don't do it that way, man, you can smell it from a mile away, man.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that there are any, apart from even the image that did make all the fronts while I was in Iraq. I don't think in my career there's one image that's made a front page that I would keep and put in a portfolio of images. So that just shows you that the stuff that I really like is really the stuff that most people don't see. And it's, you know, people will say, "Oh, you shot that picture?" Yeah, and I really like that picture. And I have really weird reasons for really liking that picture, but that's the stuff that I really enjoy doing. Is most people never see that stuff, you know, and they're surprised when they do see it. But I don't think there is a picture that I would take from a front page that I've had that I would want to keep and show.
And that's one thing I know from knowing you and things you've told me. There's times where you're looking at a picture and you're saying, "There's a tragedy here. This is a person's life being destroyed. I'm not going to sell this picture. I'm not going to publish this picture. I'm going to delete this picture." You know, you have your own personal standards, which I have the utmost respect for. That you're not gonna. I mean, there's so many people, and I mean, especially now with social media, and everyone's a photographer now because everyone has an iPhone, and people just shoot. I mean, there's whole websites that are dedicated to debasing people, right? You know, and the fact that you're a professional and you drew that line a long time ago is very respectable. So you got some kids and you got some nice things about the euphoria of Iraq as it kicks off. And they're liberated, and there's also some horror mixed in there as well. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. And it always comes when you least expect it. And we just moved into this new house in Baghdad, and everything was set up, and all the comms were set up, and I don't know, it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and a call came in, and the call just said a photographer and a TV guy need to get to this address in Baghdad. And I was sitting there, and Jack said, "Kieran, you know, off you go, and take a vest and a hat." We always had to travel with those, and we travelled in armoured vehicles everywhere. So we went to this address, and I got out onto the pavement, and I was looking around, and we had no idea why we'd been called. And somebody came running up to me as soon as they saw the cameras, and they said, "Are you the photographer from Reuters?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Okay, wait here." And they went to get a gentleman, and he came out, and he was, I couldn't understand what he was saying, and there was somebody there sort of translating, and it soon came to pass that his son had just been killed he'd found an IED, and he'd just been, it had just blown up while he and his friends were playing with it, and it was a kid that was killed, his son, and the father just had said something to the interpreter, and the interpreter said, "Listen, can you wait? He'll be back." And he came back with a plastic bag, and I wasn't even up until that moment. I just wasn't aware of what was going on. But I think the TV cameraman had sort of grasped the situation a little bit quicker than me, and he started to produce body parts from the bag that was, and you know, they were unrecognizable as body parts, but they were coming out of this bag, and the interpreter saying, "He needs you to photograph this because he wants you to show the rest of the world that his son was killed playing with an IED, and he doesn't want his son's death to be in vain, and he can't start grieving until you take these pictures." And so I think I took 6 or 7 pictures, and he ended up putting the plastic bag back down on the floor, and he just said thank you, and it was just shukran, and then he walked in, and the interpreter said now he can start to grieve. And it was then that I noticed that the TV journalist, or the cameraman, was Iraqi, and he just completely collapsed. I remember having to get him back into the car because what he just witnessed was just so shocking. And I was just numb going all the way back to the office because, you know, I just hadn't anticipated anything like that happening. And it had just come out of the blue. And I understood why. I could understand the father's sentiments. I totally got what he was trying to do. But at the same time, I totally understood that this, you know, those images couldn't go on the wire. They were just so utterly horrific and graphic. And I remember as I was shooting it, I wasn't even looking. So I remember my eye was to the camera, but I wasn't even looking at what was, you know. So if you were to, apart from the first moment, if you were to say to me, you know, what, I couldn't tell you. I just knew that it was just coming out and being held up and being put back. I couldn't even bring myself to look. And then I sort of got back, and the first thing I did was just delete. And I never actually said to my bosses there that I'd deleted those images. I just thought, I am not putting those images on the wire. I sort of took an executive decision there and then at that time. I didn't mention anything to anyone else there. And the only thing I had that I kept was just a portrait of the father. So we could move the portrait of the father and talk about the story. And I think I then spoke to my dad that night, and I sort of, you know, took the big hand sat phone and just rang him, and I just told him what had just happened. And we were sitting in the garden, and then that night, Reuters wanted to give the staff a break, and so they'd organised a barbecue, and there was, there was going to be I think a belly dancer turned up, and it was an amazing night because all the Iraqis that had not been able to party in 40 years were all sitting on the roofs of their houses surrounding the house that we were on, and they were just listening to the music. And it was an incredible thing to see. But you'd gone from something that happened like that at 5 o'clock to a barbecue that was happening at 7 p.m. And those moments were incredibly difficult to sort of disseminate and work out what was going on and of course it was something I kept to myself, apart from I think maybe they found out, maybe the TV journalist had said something, but I just didn't want to speak to anyone remotely connected to the office about what had just happened, you know. And I think, to be honest, they would have completely agreed that this is not imagery that we can put out, you know, it serves no purpose, and it's just, you know, just not imagery that they would move. So yeah, there was plenty of that in Iraq, and you sort of had to just take it in your stride, because the next day you'd be up and there'd be the next story, and you'd sort of move on to that, but that would still be in the back of your mind, you know. And then, you know, quite honestly, soon enough, you know, if you're busy and you're doing a lot of stuff, when you're sitting around and not doing anything, that's when you really begin to think about stuff. But if you're busy and you're out and you're traveling, so a week after that, I was taking anything. And he was, even if I was being, you know, sent out on stuff that I thought, oh, why am I being sent to do this? You know, I didn't mind. I just thought, I'll take it.
It's better than sitting around and
just
being with your own
totally,
thoughts.
Totally, yeah, absolutely. You know,
and it's also weird, and it's hard for people that haven't been in a war zone before to understand how things like what you're talking about. This obviously everyone anticipates or expects that there's the horror of war, but they don't understand the barbecue part. Like that's a hard thing for people to understand. That you can be just 3 months into this war, and we've got the Reuters staff having a staff party. I mean, okay, people in America know what a little staff office party is. Hey guys, we're going to order some pizzas. They do that in these war zones, and the military does it. I mean, I've talked about it a bunch. I mean, these big bases that we had eventually built had Subway sandwiches, the company Subway and the company Burger King and the company Starbucks were on these bases. So if you wanted to have a little Subway party for your boys, you could do that. Fire up the grill, have, so it's really a hard dichotomy for people to understand that inside the protected areas, we carve out little chunks of America, little chunks of freedom. Did you take any pictures of the Iraqis looking at the party?
Yeah, I did.
That must be pretty. That must have been awesome.
Yeah, but you know what? They weren't great pictures because it was so dark, and it was. I took a few, and I saw, and of course there were other photographers there that were taking stuff as well. So yeah, I did, and I've always thought about that. I remember those pictures, but they weren't good enough. I just didn't shoot it well enough. I just didn't have the right lens, and and I think that was the sort of a, that might have been as a result of what had happened earlier. But yeah, and I have thought about that. I have thought about those, and it remains with me as a memory that I saw, because I think, it's like if you concentrate so hard on taking pictures of stuff, you never actually take anything in. But that was a moment that I really wanted to take in, because it was just incredible to see these people out on their roofs just enjoying the music and not being afraid. And, somebody said to me, this has not happened in 40 years. And I just thought that was just incredible.
And those are the people that I talk about. I always end up trying to explain to people that the normal citizen in Iraq is a normal person that wants to have a job and raise their kids and have a house, and that's what they want to do. And it's really hard. America does a terrible job of showing that. America media does a terrible job of showing what that is. All you see is the crazies. All you see is the extremists. But that's a great example of people going, hey, you know what? We've been oppressed for 40 years. They're listening to music. This is awesome. Let's watch them. And those are the people that wanted to take Iraq in the right direction. Yeah. And you did end up getting some pretty important, or maybe not important, well, maybe important, but you ended up with some pictures that did end up on the front pages of
that's right.
newspapers.
That's right. It was coming off the back of another amazing story where I'd been to Najaf to follow a cleric who was coming back, who'd been exiled 40 years before by Saddam, and he was coming back to Najaf, and I'd spent 2 or 3 days down there waiting for him, and that whole scenario of him turning up with thousands of followers and being pushed into the mosque as I'm trying to photograph him, and finding myself in the middle of a mosque as a Westerner, just thinking, how did I get in here? It was just, and that's what happens when you stand in front of the door and wait for the guy to turn up. You're just going to get taken in with him. So, and I'd done that, and I'd really enjoyed that job and the sort of anticipation of waiting for this guy to turn up. And it was an incredible moment. And I'd left, and of course in those days when I had walked from the mosque in Najaf back to the hotel, which was probably a mile, and you didn't think twice. I had all my camera gear around me. You just didn't think twice about walking down that street. And we got back into our armored vehicle and we travelled back to Baghdad. And about 3/4 of the way there, we got a call, and it said, you need to turn off to, there's a mass grave has been found at Hilla, and you're en route. Well, you're going to pass it on the way back into Baghdad, so can you stop off and have a look? And my first reaction was I was so shattered from the 4 days in Najaf that I was sort of slightly resigned about having to, really, because we have to be back in Baghdad before it's dark, and I had a really sort of ambivalent attitude to it. So we found this place and we pulled up, and everyone said, right, hey guys, you've got literally 40 minutes but we got to be out of here before the sun's down. So we got out, and I just sort of walked over this mound, and as I walked over the mound that was here, there was just hundreds of bodies just laid out in front of me, and they'd been there, I think it was probably about 4 or 5 days. I think it was obvious how long they'd been there because you could see how many bodies that they'd pulled out of the pit that they dug there, and it was obviously an execution spot where Saddam had taken them. I don't know how many years before, and they'd all been executed. Just a bullet to the back of the head, all men, and they were they dug them up and pulled the bodies out. And I imagine the relatives had obviously had an idea of where they were, but they were never able to do anything until, they were in a position. Baghdad had been liberated, and they felt it was safe enough now to go and try. And I think they knew Saddam was on the run, so they were excavating this area, and they'd found all these bodies, and they put these bodies into plastic bags, and they had a name tag on each body. And that's when I realized, okay, that this is probably quite, well, this is bigger than any other mass grave that I'd shot during my time there. So I started shooting it, and I knew the light was going down, and the light was incredible. It was just incredible, the light on the sand and everything. And I just started shooting, and I started shooting the women that were sitting around the edge behind the barbed wire. So they'd obviously made the women sit around, and then when they'd finished digging, the women were able to walk through the bodies and try and identify the family members. And they were just picking up ID cards and, trying to sort of figure out who was who. And I remember there was one really bizarre moment where somebody had taken a body, or what was remains of the skeleton and the corpse, and they laid it out in the shape of somebody just lying on the ground. It wasn't a case of the remains were put into a plastic bag. They had actually almost constructed this person as they were. And so they were laid out, and it looked like a person lying on the ground with their arms out and their legs in the correct position and their head to one side. And I just remember a young kid just walking past holding his dad's hand, just staring at this. And I thought that must be an unbelievable thing for a kid that age to be staring at. And I remember taking that picture, and it's, I remember thinking, that is, I've never seen anything like that. And I thought somebody has actually gone to the trouble of trying to do this. And I couldn't work out why. And I thought, why have they done this? I was pretty sure that it didn't help with the identification of that person, but somebody had gone to the trouble of laying this corpse out. So I shot that picture, and I started moving around and shooting the women, and the women were crying. And I subsequently found out they were crying because I had turned up with a camera. So I had altered that situation. And when they realized that I was no longer interested in shooting them because they were crying because they thought this is what this photographer needs to see. They went back to playing with their dice. And so I sort of moved away. I thought, well, I won't be taking any more pictures of that. And just shot and saw, and they had, and I know this isn't the right word, but remind me, Jocko, what's the American version of a JCB?
Oh, a backhoe. A
backhoe.
Right.
So they had a backhoe in this pit pulling out the bodies, and they had a couple of kids underneath collecting the remains and just putting them to one side. And these kids were doing it as if it was just another day, It was impossible to see if there was any shock or any, they were just getting on with it. It was as if they knew this job has to be done, so we're going to do it. And they were just, I remember seeing a skull roll off the claw of this backhoe, and this kid caught it. He just caught it like a goalkeeper would catch a football, and then just put it into a bag. And I watched that one. I didn't actually shoot that one. And so it was a case of getting the job done as quickly as possible, getting back in the van, and getting back to Baghdad. And I got back to Baghdad, and I moved, I think, 4 or 5 images, because I was never really a person to move a lot of imagery. I thought if I had some really good stuff, I didn't want to dilute it with stuff that I thought was inferior, so I just put the 4 or 5 best images out. And was just hanging around when the chief came in, and he said, listen, how many pictures did you move of that story? And I said, no, maybe 4 or 5. And he said, right, okay, you better move some more, because it's become the #1 story in the world. And I think there was over 2,000 bodies they discovered at this place. And of course I then thought, geez, okay, right. And then I just sort of slightly panicked, because I thought, well, I've just edited my stuff and I've moved 5 pictures. What am I now going to find in there that's going to improve the file. So I went through my, on my computer screen, just going through the pictures and thinking, oh, do you know what? I really wish that I'd spent a little bit more time shooting that moment, because I'd shot it and thought, actually, do you know what? I'm going to get something a bit stronger than that in a minute. So, and then I'd see another image and I'd work it through and I think, okay, I think the fourth image in this sequence is going to be the one. And then I realized there wasn't the fourth image. And I just kept saying to myself, what were you doing? And of course, at the time, I had no idea that this was going to be the number one story in the world. And so I ended up moving, maybe 15 pictures, maybe more from this. And every time I put a picture out, I thought, God, you know what? And it just so annoyed me that I hadn't maybe approached the job as in the right manner. I just had seen the light and I'd shot what I thought would be really strong. And like I say, in my career, I miss as many pictures as I get. In fact, I miss more than I get. And I can tell you about all the great pictures I didn't take. And that would make a great book. But so I was just really angry with myself and angry that I'd had this opportunity and I'd maybe blown it, and I thought, well, this is why I'm here. I'm here to shoot this. I'm here to show the world that this is what's happening. And, and how could I have been so stupid as to not have concentrated a little bit harder while I was there? And I know we only had half an hour to 40 minutes, but still I could have shot 5 times as much in that time, but I didn't. I just chose to meticulously walk through, pick my moments and shoot them. So we moved these pictures, and fortunately the next day, I think it was an image of a woman walking past a skull that was and I shot it from really low down on the ground, and it was an upright, and that's what suited most of the papers, as an upright image, a vertical. And that was what got used on all the New York Times, everywhere. The Washington Post, all the British newspapers, everywhere around the world had run with this story. And although we were the first guy there were a couple of other photographers that were there at the time with me, but they didn't work for an international wire agency. And that's the beauty about working for an international wire agency, is that their reach and their clout is just phenomenal. It doesn't matter whether you're working for a newspaper, but as soon as you work for an international wire agency, particularly one as good as Reuters, you then realize, actually, when I've got this picture, it's really going to get out there. Everybody is going to see it, and that's a huge buzz. And it did, and it made the play was incredible. And then my chief said to me, okay, Kieran, well, you're going back to tomorrow. And again, I thought, yeah, but you know what? I've just been there, and I had pretty much the place to myself. And I knew going down the next day when I drove there, it was a zoo. There was just every photographer and every cameraman in Iraq was at Hilla. And you couldn't shoot anything without getting another photographer or a cameraman or a sound boom, because of and there were I think I did take a couple of pictures that day, a couple of strong pictures of a woman that had just discovered her husband, and she was surrounded by a family. And the bane of every photographer's life is the sound man's boom. And this woman was making this, it was this dreadful wailing. I mean, I still remember it now. It was awful, the noise she was making. It was really guttural. And it really went right through you. And I remember being really down low and in close and trying to photograph this, and the next thing, this furry boom just comes over microphone, and he's trying to record the sound. And that's what it was like. And you're getting annoyed at a sound man who's just stepped in and trying to do something when you're trying to, and you think, and I'm getting annoyed with a guy who's trying to record a woman who's plumbing the depth of grief. And I'm annoyed at him, and I'm not thinking, well, listen, what about her? And in those situations, you're not thinking about that. You're just, I need to shoot this picture. So, yep. The next day it was a zoo, but I was able to stand back and think, I got lucky that yesterday, And I learned a really valuable lesson, which is go into every situation like that as if you're never going to see a situation like that again.
And actually, even further back, there was a chance that you could have said, "Oh, I know we can't make it. We won't be home before dark, so we're just going to head back to Baghdad."
And of course, but that's right. But ultimately, in that car, that probably wasn't going to be my call. Mm-hmm. So somebody in the car, and I think I was with 3 or 4 others. Maybe the journalist might have been the most senior in the armored vehicle at the time, and she would have made that call, and she would have just said, "Listen, if this is what they want, we need to go and do it." So it came out okay at the end, but that was close.
I had when I was in my first SEAL platoon, my leading petty officer, who is the senior, well, not even the senior, but the second senior of the enlisted guys. Anyways, he had this mantra, and the mantra was always go out. Now, when he said always go out, what he meant was always go out to the bar. Always go out. You pull in somewhere for a night, go out. That's always go out. There's always some fun to be had. And I actually, in my mind, I always twisted that mantra from his always go out to go to the bar or go to the club. I changed it to just always go out, period. So if there's an opportunity, if there's an operation coming up, go out. If there's a bar to go to, go out. If there's something to do, go and do it. Mm-hmm. It's just a little something to think about. And it remind when you're sitting there thinking, maybe it wouldn't have been your call, but if it was your call, maybe you would have sloughed it off. Sure. And if you had the attitude of, always go out. Okay.
Yeah.
Then you would have been there 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And